She was just a poor waitress, working the late shift at a lonely all-night diner. He was the city's most powerful and feared mafia boss. Their worlds were never meant to collide. But one night, in the rain-slicked alley behind her diner, she finds a young man, unconscious and near death. His wallet is empty, except for a single cryptic note with a phone number and a chilling warning. "If you find me, do not call an ambulance. Call this number. Trust no one." Torn between her fear and her conscience, she makes the call. And on the other end of the line is the mafia boss. The young man dying on the pavement is his estranged son. She has just saved the heir to a criminal empire, pulling herself into a dangerous world of secrets and violence. The best doctors in the country are baffled by the boy's mysterious condition, but she, the simple waitress who found him, begins to suspect that his collapse was no accident. As the powerful father begins to rely on her as the only person who can get through to his silent, broken son, can she uncover the truth of what really happened that night? Or will her compassion make her the next target of the person who wants the boy to stay silent forever? The Beacon Diner in a gritty, forgotten corner of Boston was a small island of light in the growing twilight. It smelled of stale coffee, fried onions, and the kind of quiet desperation that clings to places open 24 hours a day. For Alice, it was just another Saturday night. She moved through the narrow spaces between the worn vinyl booths with an easy, practiced grace, her coffee pot a constant familiar weight in her hand. She was tired, but she was a survivor, and this was her world. He came in just as the dinner rush was beginning to fade. He was a quiet, haunted-looking young man in his early 20s who always took the same booth in the far back corner. He was handsome, with dark, intense eyes and a jawline that seemed too sharp and too aristocratic for his worn jeans and faded denim jacket. He never ordered more than a single cup of black coffee, which he would nurse for hours while sketching furiously in a small, leather-bound notebook. Alice felt a quiet, distant sympathy for him. He looked like a man who was trying to outrun his own shadow, a ghost haunting the edges of the city. Tonight he looked worse than usual. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes and a pale, sweaty sheen on his forehead. Later, when the diner had emptied out into a comfortable quiet, she went over to his booth with a fresh pot of coffee. "Another refill?" she asked, her voice gentle. He looked up, startled, his eyes darting around the near-empty diner with a flicker of paranoia that made her own heart beat a little faster. "No, thanks. I'm fine," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "You look a little pale," she said, unable to stop the kind, worried words from leaving her lips. "Are you feeling all right?" His expression closed down, a hard, defensive wall slamming into place. "I'm just tired," he said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "Okay," she said softly, turning to leave him to his solitude. "Wait." The word was a quiet, desperate command. She turned back. He was staring at her, his dark eyes full of a strange, urgent fear. He seemed to be having an internal battle with himself. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he grabbed a napkin from the dispenser, scribbled something on it with a pen from his jacket, and folded it into a tight, small square. He pushed it across the worn Formica tabletop toward her. "Look, this is going to sound crazy," he said, his voice a low, intense whisper that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "But if you ever see me in trouble, if something happens to me out there." He gestured vaguely toward the dark street outside. "Don't call the police, don't call an ambulance, just call this number, trust no one else, please." Before she could process his strange, terrifying words, before she could even ask a single question, he threw a crumpled $10 bill onto the table, slid out of the booth, and rushed out of the diner, disappearing into the dark, rain-slicked night. Alice stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding. The normal, comforting sounds of the diner, the clatter of plates in the kitchen, the low hum of the refrigerator, seemed to fade into a distant echo. Her world had suddenly gone quiet. Her fingers, trembling slightly, closed around the small folded napkin. Slowly she unfolded it. On it was a single phone number, written in a frantic, spidery script, and below it, the two sentences that had just changed her life. Do not call the police. Call this number." She stared at the napkin, a cold, creeping sense of dread mixing with the sympathy she felt for the lost, haunted boy. She didn't know who he was, or what kind of terrible trouble he was running from, but she had a profound and sinking feeling that her simple, quiet, and predictable life had just become very, very complicated. Alice stood by the empty booth for a long time, the strange napkin clutched in her hand. The urgent, paranoid words of the young man, Ethan, echoed in her mind. "Don't call the police, don't call an ambulance." It was the kind of crazy, dramatic thing you saw in movies, not the kind of thing that happened on a slow Saturday night at a Boston diner. "Alice, table 4 needs a check," the gruff voice of the cook yelled from the kitchen, shattering the strange spell. She shook her head, as if to clear it. He was just a troubled kid, she told herself, a little paranoid. She carefully folded the napkin and tucked it deep into the pocket of her apron, a strange and unsettling souvenir from a strange encounter, and went back to work. Hours passed. The last of the late-night customers shuffled out into the damp spring evening. The cook shut off the grill. Alice wiped down the last of the sticky countertops, her body aching with the familiar fatigue of a long shift. The strange, intense encounter with the boy had all but faded from her mind. Just another weird story in a city full of them. Her final task of the night was the one she always hated, taking the heavy, clinking bags of trash out to the dumpster in the back alley. She pushed the heavy metal back door open with her hip, the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light above it, flickering to life. The alley was dark, slick with a recent rain, and smelled of wet garbage and old grease. And then she saw him. Slumped against the grimy brick wall, half hidden in the shadows, was Ethan. His long legs were sprawled out in front of him, his head lolled to the side. His sketchbook lay open on the wet pavement beside him, the intricate ink drawings of cityscapes, now a blurry, bleeding mess in a dirty puddle. He was completely, deathly still, his face pale and waxy in the harsh, buzzing light. A wave of pure, cold terror and adrenaline shot through her. The trash bag dropped from her hands, its contents spilling across the alley. Her first normal human instinct screamed at her, "Call 911." She fumbled in her apron pocket, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely unlock her phone. Her thumb was hovering over the emergency call button when his words, the words from the napkin, came rushing back, as clear and as urgent as if he were whispering them in her ear right now. "Don't call the police, don't call an ambulance, call this number. Trust no one else." She was frozen in a state of agonizing indecision. The man on the ground was clearly dying, or already dead. To not call for help felt like a monstrous, inhuman act. But the look in his eyes when he had given her the note, it had been a look of such primal, gut-wrenching terror. What was he running from? Who was he so afraid of that was worse than dying alone in a dark alley? She looked down at the boy's pale, still face, and in a terrible, reckless, and deeply compassionate leap of faith, she made her choice. She chose to trust the last wish of the terrified boy over her own common sense. She pulled the crumpled napkin from her other pocket. With a trembling finger, she dialed the number. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, a man answered. There was no greeting, just a single, cold, and dangerous-sounding word that seemed to hold a world of power and menace. "Yes?" Alice's own voice was a terrified, stammering whisper. "Hello? My name is Alice. I'm a waitress at the Beacon Diner. There's a young man here. He gave me your number. He's unconscious." In the alley behind the diner. She took a ragged breath, the final awful words catching in her throat. I think he might be dying." The line went dead. She stood there in the dark, buzzing silence of the alley, the dial tone a shrill, lonely sound in her ear. She had made the call, and she had no idea what kind of monster or what kind of savior she had just summoned into her simple, quiet life. For a long, terrifying moment after the line went dead, Alice was frozen in the buzzing silence of the alley. The dial tone in her ear was a shrill, lonely sound. She was racked with a sudden, sickening wave of doubt. What had she done? She should have called 911. She should have followed the rules, the law. The boy was dying, and she had just wasted precious minutes on a cryptic, insane instruction from a paranoid stranger. Her hand was halfway to her pocket to dial for a real ambulance when she heard it. Not a distant siren, but a low, powerful hum. Less than 2 minutes after her call had ended, 2 sleek, black, and utterly silent sedans slid into the mouth of the alley. Their bright white headlights cut through the darkness, pinning her against the grimy brick wall like a terrified animal caught in a hunter's gaze. The car doors opened with a soft, expensive click. 4 large men in dark, perfectly tailored suits emerged. They were not paramedics. They moved with a calm, silent, and disciplined menace that was more frightening than any frantic haste could have been. They ignored her completely, as if she were just another piece of trash in the alley. 2 of the men went directly to Ethan. One knelt, his fingers going to the boy's neck to check for a pulse. The other opened the trunk of one of the cars and produced a discreet, foldable stretcher. With an expert, practiced gentleness, they lifted Ethan's limp body and secured him. The other 2 men did not help. They created a silent perimeter, their eyes cold and watchful, scanning the dark windows and rooftops of the surrounding buildings. This was not a rescue. It was an extraction. As they were loading the stretcher into the back of one of the sedans, a 3rd car, a magnificent, long, black Bentley, pulled up, blocking the alley's entrance completely. The back door opened, and Don Silas Thorne stepped out. He was not a large or physically imposing man, but he moved with an aura of such quiet, absolute authority that the very air around him seemed to grow still. He was impeccably dressed, his face sharp and intelligent, his pale grey eyes missing nothing. But the mask of cold control was cracked. His face was a canvas of a tightly controlled, and therefore all the more terrifying, paternal panic. He did not look at his son. He walked directly to Alice, who was still frozen against the wall, unable to move, unable to breathe. He stopped a few feet in front of her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. "You," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that cut through the night. "You are the waitress? Alice?" The fact that he already knew her name sent a fresh wave of ice-cold terror through her. She could only manage a single, terrified and jerky nod. His men had retrieved Ethan's wallet, and now Silas was holding the crumpled, damp napkin she had tucked back into the boy's pocket for safekeeping. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. "You made the call," he stated. It was not a question. She nodded again, her throat too tight to speak. He studied her face for a long, silent, and unnerving moment, his cold, grey eyes memorizing every detail, as if he were committing a witness to memory. Then, without another word, without a flicker of thanks or explanation, he turned, got back into his car, and the silent, dark convoy of sedans slipped out of the alley and disappeared into the Boston night as quickly and as quietly as it had arrived. Alice was left alone, her body trembling with a delayed, violent shock. The alley was empty now, except for the spilled trash from the bag she had dropped and the rain-smudged, forgotten sketchbook lying in a puddle. It was as if the whole terrifying cinematic event had been a dream. She had just looked into the eyes of a very dangerous, very powerful, and very broken man. She didn't know if she had just saved a life, or if she had just signed her own death warrant by becoming a witness to something she was never meant to see. She only knew, with an absolute and soul-deep certainty, that her simple, quiet, and predictable life was over. The silent black convoy carrying the unconscious heir to the Thorne Empire did not go to a public hospital. It sped through the sleeping city to a discreet private medical facility, a state-of-the-art clinic funded by and exclusively for the use of Silas Thorne and his organization. It was a place where money could buy the best doctors, the best equipment, and, most importantly, absolute silence. The moment they arrived, a team of Boston's top medical experts descended upon Ethan. They worked with a calm professional urgency, wheeling him into a room filled with the quiet, urgent hum of advanced medical technology. They ran every test imaginable, MRIs, CT scans, a full toxicology panel. Silas was left to pace the sterile, white waiting room like a caged lion, his immense power and influence utterly, infuriatingly useless. He was not a don here. He was just a father, terrified of losing his son. Hours later, the lead doctor, a renowned neurologist named Dr. Alistair Finch, met him in a small, cold conference room. The doctor's face was grim. "Silas," he began, his voice the tired, clinical tone of a man delivering bad news. "We have the results. And I have to be honest with you, we are baffled." He explained the tests. "There is no sign of a stroke, no aneurysm, no internal bleeding or head trauma. The initial toxicology reports are completely clean. No heroin, no fentanyl, no common street drugs, no alcohol. Physically, he appears to be unharmed." "Then what is wrong with him?" Silas demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "His brain activity," the doctor said, shaking his head, "is deeply suppressed. It is a profound, coma-like state. But it doesn't present like any coma I have ever seen before. There is no clear cause, no medical explanation for his condition. It simply makes no sense." The doctor gave him the hopeless verdict. "All we can do for now is provide supportive care and monitor him. But I have to be honest with you. In cases like this, where the cause is unknown, the prognosis is not good. We are, for all intents and purposes, completely in the dark." The words were a devastating blow. Silas, a man who believed that every problem had a solution that could be bought, bullied, or beaten into submission, was being told that there was no solution. His wealth, which could bend the entire city to his will, could not buy his own son's consciousness back. As the doctor was about to leave, a memory, a small strange detail from the alley surfaced in Silas's mind. "Wait," he said, his voice sharp. "The waitress, the girl who found him. She said she smelled something on his breath." He paused, trying to recall her exact terrified words. "Bitter almonds." Dr. Finch considered this for a moment, then dismissed it with a tired wave of his hand. Bitter almonds is the classic textbook sign of cyanide poisoning. But Silas, the toxicology report is one of the most comprehensive in the world. It's completely clean. There is not a single trace of cyanide or any related compound in his system. He gave a small, patronizing sigh. The girl was clearly mistaken. A dark alley, a stressful situation. She was panicked. She imagined it. He left Silas standing alone in the sterile white hallway, just outside the silent, glass-walled room, where his son lay like a sleeping prince under a curse. The world of science and medicine, the world of 1,000 doctors he could summon with a single phone call, had given him their final, hopeless verdict. They were in the dark. He was left with nothing but a baffling, unsolvable mystery, a dying son, and the memory of a terrified waitress in an alley, a witness whose only clue had just been dismissed as a fantasy. He looked through the glass at his son, and then his gaze grew distant, a new, cold and calculating resolve forming in his eyes. The doctors had reached a dead end, but his investigation, he knew, was just beginning, and it had to begin with her. Alice did not sleep. She spent the rest of the night huddled in a chair in her small third-floor apartment, jumping at every creak of the old building, every siren in the distant city. The image of the silent black cars disappearing into the night was burned into her mind. She had stumbled into a world she knew nothing about, a world of powerful, dangerous men, and she was terrified of what would happen now that they knew her name. The knock on her door came just after dawn. It was not the police. It was two of the same large, silent men in dark, impeccably tailored suits from the alley. They were polite, but their presence was an implicit, unbreakable command. "Mr. Thorne would like to see you," the taller of the two men said, his voice a low, flat monotone. She knew this was not a request. The ride to the Thorne estate was a silent journey to another planet. They left her gritty, working-class Boston neighborhood behind and drove north along the coast, the scenery transforming from brick and concrete to the rugged, breathtaking beauty of the Massachusetts shoreline. Finally, they turned onto a long private road and passed through a set of imposing iron gates, entering a world of manicured lawns and old, whispering trees. The mansion itself was a magnificent stone fortress that looked out over the churning grey Atlantic. She was not brought to a comfortable living room. She was escorted into Silas Thorne's study. It was a cold, imposing room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and a single vast window that looked out onto the stormy, unforgiving sea. It was the room of a king, a man accustomed to power and solitude. Silas was standing by the window, his back to her. He did not turn when she entered. "Sit," he commanded, his voice a low growl. She sat, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. He finally turned to face her. His handsome face was a mask of cold, controlled intensity. The grieving, panicked father from the alley was gone. This was the Don. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the moment my son walked into your diner. Every word, every gesture. Do not leave out a single detail." For the next hour, he interrogated her. He was not cruel, but he was relentless, his sharp, intelligent questions picking apart her story piece by piece. What was Ethan's exact demeanor? What were his exact words? Who else was in the diner? Did he speak to anyone? Did anyone look at him? What did she see in the alley? He came back again and again to the one strange detail. "The scent," he said, his pale grey eyes fixed on hers. "Bitter almonds. Are you absolutely certain?" "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. It was faint, but it was there. "I'm sorry." "Do not be sorry for telling the truth," he said, his voice flat. When she was finished, he was silent for a long, unnerving time, just studying her, his mind clearly working, processing, analyzing. She felt like a bug under a microscope. "You know too much," he said finally, the words a cold, simple statement of fact. "And you may have seen something you don't even realize you saw. Until I find out who did this to my son, you are a liability." He paused, his next words even more chilling. "And you are a target." He stood up, the interview over. "You will be staying here, in this house. You will be given a suite of rooms, anything you need. But you will not leave the grounds. You will not contact anyone from your old life. You are the only person who was there that night. Until my son wakes up, or until I find the person responsible, you are under my protection." His eyes were like chips of ice. "Whether you like it or not." Alice stared at him, her heart sinking. She was not just a witness anymore. She was now a protected prisoner, a bird in a beautiful, terrifying, gilded cage, trapped in the center of a dangerous mystery she never wanted any part of. The first few days of Alice's captivity were a blur of surreal luxury and profound, terrifying loneliness. She was a ghost, haunting a magnificent suite of rooms with a breathtaking view of the sea, a place that felt more like a five-star hotel than a prison. A silent housekeeper brought her gourmet meals she had no appetite for. A closet had been filled with expensive clothes in her size, fabrics softer than anything she had ever touched. She had everything a person could want, except the one thing she craved, her freedom. The silent, stone-faced guard posted in the hallway outside her door was a constant, unnerving reminder of her situation. She was a witness, a tool, a piece on a chessboard she didn't understand. And she was slowly going mad with the boredom and the fear. On the third day, she realized there was only one thing in this house that felt real to her, the one person who was the reason she was here at all. She felt a strange, nagging sense of responsibility for the unconscious boy in the alley. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, she asked her guard. "I want to see him," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The boy, Ethan." The guard, surprised by the direct request, made a phone call. A minute later he nodded. "Mr. Thorne has approved it." She was escorted to the private medical wing of the mansion. The atmosphere was sterile, the air chilled, the only sound the soft, rhythmic beep and whir of the life support machines. She entered the room and saw him. He lay in the center of the bed, pale and still, a dozen wires and tubes connecting him to the machines that were keeping him alive. He looked like a fallen prince from a sad fairy tale. A nurse was in the room, silently checking his vitals. Alice simply pulled up a chair to the bedside a few feet away and sat. She didn't say anything. She just sat there for an hour, a quiet human presence in the cold clinical room, bearing witness to the boy's silent struggle. The next day she came back. This time she brought a book with her from the mansion's vast library, a well-worn copy of an old adventure novel. She sat down, opened it and began to read aloud. Her voice was a soft, warm and living sound in the sterile silence. She didn't know if he could hear her. The doctors had said he was unresponsive, but she felt it was better than the cold, lonely beeping of the machines. She made it her new routine. Every day she would spend hours at his bedside, her voice a steady, gentle current, reading him stories of pirates and explorers, of distant lands and grand adventures. The rotating team of private nurses watched her with a quiet, baffled curiosity. They were paid to tend to his body, to monitor the machines. This quiet, captive waitress was, for reasons no one could understand, tending to his soul. Of course, they were not the only ones watching. In his dark security room, Silas Thorne watched it all. Day after day, he saw this young woman, this girl he had effectively kidnapped, voluntarily go to his son's bedside. He watched her read for hours, her expression one of a deep, uncomplicated compassion. He saw her, at the end of one of her visits, reach out and gently, maternally, smooth the hair back from his son's forehead. He was a man who understood transactions, motives, angles, but he could not, for the life of him, understand this. She had no obligation to do this. She was his prisoner. She owed his family nothing, and yet she was performing this simple, profound and selfless act of kindness, day after day. He watched the simple act of tenderness on the cold, grainy screen. The girl he had imprisoned as a tool for his investigation, as a potential key to a mystery, was showing his son more genuine human care than anyone had since his wife had died. The cold suspicion in his heart was still there, but it was now at war with a new, growing, and deeply unsettling feeling of admiration. He didn't understand her, and that, for a man like Silas Thorne, was the most intriguing and most dangerous mystery of all. A week passed, and a strange, quiet routine took hold in the Thorne mansion. During the day, Alice was a ghost in a gilded cage, reading from the vast library or walking the lonely, manicured gardens under the watchful eye of a silent guard. But every afternoon for 3 hours, she would go to the medical wing. These hours became the center of her world. Her vigil was a constant, steady presence in the sterile, hopeless room. She would read to Ethan, her voice a low, warm murmur against the cold, rhythmic beeping of the machines. She would talk to him, telling him about her day, about the books she was reading, about the colors of the sunset over the ocean. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she felt, with a profound and unshakable certainty, that he was not gone. He was just lost. One afternoon, as she was sitting by his bed reading, a nurse came in to perform her routine care, which included cleaning his mouth to prevent infection. As the nurse worked, a faint, almost imperceptible scent wafted up from the pillows. It was the smell. Bitter almonds. It was incredibly faint, a ghost of a scent, but it was the same strange, chemical smell she had noticed in the dark alley. The smell the world-renowned Dr. Finch had so contemptuously dismissed as a panicked fantasy. But it was here. It was real. Her mind began to race, 1,000 possibilities clicking into place. If the toxicology reports were clean, as Silas had told her, it meant the poison wasn't in his blood. But if the smell was still here, days later, lingering on his breath, what could that mean? It had to be something that didn't enter the bloodstream in a normal way, something designed to break down slowly, something exotic, something the tests weren't even looking for. She realized with a jolt of pure, cold clarity that the doctor, in all his scientific certainty, had been looking for a medical event. He had never considered that he should have been looking for a murder weapon. She knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she had to tell him. She found Silas in his study that evening, staring at a wall of security monitors that showed nothing but empty, silent rooms. He looked like a king surveying a dead kingdom. He looked up as she entered, his expression weary and guarded. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her own voice trembling slightly with the audacity of what she was about to say. "I know your doctor said I was mistaken, and I know this is not my place. But I smelled it again." His eyes sharpened, a flicker of interest in their grey depths. "Smelled what?" "The bitter almonds," she said. "It's on his breath. It's faint, but it's there. I'm not imagining it." She took a brave step forward, her own logical mind, a mind she had not used for anything but calculating diner checks in years, now working with a desperate clarity. "If the blood tests were clean, it means the poison isn't circulating in his system anymore. But if the smell is still there, it must be something that was designed to act quickly and then disappear, or something the standard tests wouldn't screen for." a specialty poison, something that was designed not to be found. The words hung in the silent room. This was not the rambling of a hysterical waitress. This was a sharp, logical, and terrifyingly plausible deduction. It was the language of his own world, a world of assassins, of untraceable methods, of betrayals planned with a chemist's cruel precision. In that moment, Silas's perception of her shifted completely. She was not just a compassionate girl who had stumbled into his life. She was an asset, an intelligent, observant, and potentially crucial partner in his investigation. The admiration he had felt for her heart was now joined by a new, powerful respect for her mind. He stood up and walked over to her, his expression now one of a new, sharp, and intense focus. "Tell me again," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Exactly what you smelled that night. Exactly what my son said. Every single detail." He paused, and his next words were not a command but a quiet, urgent invitation. "We are going to start from the very beginning. Together." The wall between them, the prisoner and the warden, the witness and the interrogator, had just crumbled. They were now officially partners, and their hunt for a hidden killer had just truly begun. The moment the words "specialty poison" left Alice's lips, the last of the walls between them, prisoner and warden, witness and interrogator, crumbled into dust. In that instant, they were no longer defined by their stations. They were simply a team, two people united by a single, desperate, and dangerous purpose: to find the truth. Silas looked at Alice, his gaze now full of a new, sharp, and profound respect. "You are no longer a prisoner in this house, Alice," he said, his voice a low, formal declaration. "But you are also not free to leave. Not yet. You are the only person who was there. You are the only person who noticed the one clue that matters. That makes you the most important witness I have." He paused, his expression hardening. "It also makes you a target." He laid out the new arrangement. "From this moment on, you are not my captive. You are my honored guest, and you are under my personal protection. You will have free reign of this house and its grounds. But you will not leave without me, or my most trusted men, by your side. Your old life," he finished, his words a heavy, final decree, "is on hold. Your new life is helping me find out who did this to my son." She looked at this powerful, dangerous man, at the raw, paternal pain in his eyes, and she saw the truth of his words. She was trapped in his world, but she was no longer alone in it. She gave a single, resolute nod. The investigation began the very next day. Silas brought Alice into the inner sanctum of his world, his private security room, a dark, cold space filled with monitors and maps. He was completely and terrifyingly transparent with her. He explained the landscape of his life, the constant simmering threats from rival families like the Carbones, and the even more dangerous possibility of betrayal from within his own organization. His suspicion, now sharpened by Alice's clue about a sophisticated, untraceable poison, had fallen squarely upon his own inner circle. Who had access to Ethan that night? Who knew his routine? The list was terrifyingly short, and at the very top of it was his ambitious and calculating second-in-command, Vinny. While they were beginning their secret war council, Vinny himself was observing the new dynamic with a growing sense of alarm. He saw the new, easy way Silas spoke to the waitress. He saw them walking together in the garden, their heads bent in quiet, intense conversation. He had assumed the girl was a loose end, a nobody who would be quietly paid off or scared into silence. He now saw, with a jolt of cold fear, that she had somehow become an advisor, a confidant. She was the one person who had been there that night, and she now had the Don's ear. She was the single greatest threat to his secret. Late that evening, the three of them, Silas, Alice, and Vinny, stood in the sterile, quiet medical wing, looking through the glass at the still unconscious Ethan. "Any change?" Vinny asked, his voice a perfect performance of concerned loyalty. "No," Silas said, his expression unreadable as he watched his lieutenant's reflection in the glass. "But we have a new lead, a scent, bitter almonds." He said it casually, an expert fisherman casting a line, and he watched for the faintest flicker of a reaction on Vinny's face. There was none. Vinny's mask was perfect. A tragic, But meaningless detail, I'm sure, he said smoothly. But Alice, who was also watching, saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, a flicker of something that was not surprise. It was recognition. Later, alone with Silas in his study, she told him what she had seen. He knew, Silas. When you said bitter almonds, he didn't react with surprise. He reacted with confirmation. Silas nodded grimly. The new conflict was now clear. It was no longer just a hunt for a faceless poisoner. It was a quiet, deadly, and intimate war of wits against a traitor who was standing right beside them. And the quiet, ordinary waitress had just become his most important and most unlikely soldier. With their secret alliance formed, a new and surreal routine settled over the Thorne mansion. During the day, Alice was a detective, sitting with Silas in his imposing study as they meticulously went over security logs, employee files, and the known movements of their rivals. She, a waitress from an all-night diner, was now a trusted advisor in a silent, high-stakes war. But in the afternoons, her role would shift. After hours of looking at the cold, hard facts of the investigation, she would feel an irresistible pull toward the medical wing, toward the quiet, beating heart of the entire mystery, Ethan. Her visits were no longer those of a curious witness. They were a vigil. The private nurses, now instructed to give her their full respect, would nod to her as she entered and leave her be. She would pull a comfortable chair up to his bedside, and for hours she would simply be with him. She read to him, her voice a low, steady current in the silent clinical room. She read old adventure novels, stories of the sea and of distant magical lands, filling the sterile air with tales of life and purpose. She talked to him. She told him about her day, about the frustrating, slow progress of the investigation she and his father were conducting. "We're looking for them, Ethan," she would whisper, her voice a fierce, protective promise. "The people who did this to you. We are going to find them." She spoke to him not as a patient, but as a silent partner, a confidant, and she brought him music. She brought in a small, simple music player and played soft, classical sonatas, gentle folk songs from her own childhood, melodies to fill the silence where the beeping of the machines had once been the only sound. She was trying to build a bridge to him, one made of words, of stories, and of song. Silas, from the cold blue light of his security room, would watch it all. He would see her tireless, selfless devotion, this act of pure, uncomplicated compassion she performed day after day. He saw her gently brushing a stray lock of hair from his son's forehead, her touch so full of a tenderness that made his own heart ache. Each quiet act of kindness he witnessed was a powerful, irrefutable argument against the dark, paranoid world he came from. It was a constant, steady flame of her goodness, burning away the last of his own cynical doubts. One late afternoon, as the spring sun was casting long golden shadows across the room, Alice was reading. She was tired, her voice a low, hypnotic murmur. As she read, she unconsciously reached out and took Ethan's limp, cool hand in her own, holding it gently for a simple human connection. And then she felt it. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible flutter against her palm, a ghost of a movement. She stopped reading, her own heart stopping with it. She looked at his face. His eyes were still closed, his expression was unchanged. She must have imagined it. She held her breath, her own hand completely still around his. She waited. And then it happened again. Stronger this time. A definite, unmistakable, and utterly miraculous squeeze of his fingers around her own. Her breath escaped in a sharp, silent gasp. She stared at their joined hands, her heart pounding with a new, wild and brilliant hope. It was a flicker, a whisper from the deep, dark and silent world where he was trapped. It was a sign. She did not run to tell Silas. This, for now, was a secret, a fragile, sacred promise kept just between her and Ethan. She knew now with an absolute and joyful certainty that he was in there. And he was fighting. Her vigil was no longer a one-sided conversation. She had just received the very first faint reply. The secret of Ethan's response, the small miraculous squeeze of his hand, was a precious, hopeful ember that Alice kept cupped in her own heart. She didn't tell Silas, not yet. It felt too fragile, too sacred to be spoken aloud, to be subjected to the harsh analytical world of doctors and reports. It was a promise she shared only with the silent boy in the bed. While she was tending to the slow, quiet work of the heart, Silas was engaged in the grim, brutal work of his own world. He had retreated into the persona of the Don, a man of cold calculation and quiet, lethal purpose. He trusted Alice's clue about the poison, and he trusted his gut, which was now screaming that the traitor was not a distant rival, but a snake coiled in his own house. He convened a secret war council, not in his glass-walled study, but in the anonymous, secure back room of a warehouse on the Boston docks. He met with the two oldest and most loyal capos of his organization, men who had served his father, men whose loyalty was as solid and as unshakable as granite. He did not invite Vinny. "My son was poisoned," Silas stated, his voice a low, flat growl that held no room for doubt. "The attack came from within. Our job is to find the rat." For the next week, they worked in the shadows. They meticulously reviewed every piece of security footage, every phone log, every financial transaction made by his inner circle in the weeks leading up to Ethan's collapse. It was a grim, painstaking, and paranoid process, a search for a single fatal anomaly in a world of secrets. Silas's focus was a laser, aimed squarely at his second-in-command. But Vinny was a professional, his tracks almost perfectly covered. Almost. The crack in his story was found by the older of the two capos, a man named Leo, who had an elephant's memory for the city's underworld. The clue was a single, off-the-books meeting Vinny had taken a week before Ethan's collapse. Vinny's official schedule had him at a dinner with a politician. But surveillance from a rival's territory showed Vinny's car, for a brief 20-minute window, parked outside the discreet, unassuming office of a disgraced biochemist, a man known in their world for creating specialty compounds, untraceable poisons. Silas stared at the report, a cold, hard certainty settling in his gut. It was not a smoking gun, but it was the first concrete piece of evidence that connected Vinny, however tenuously, to the method of the attack. The scent of bitter almonds. He returned to the mansion late that evening, the grim, ugly work of his investigation weighing heavily on his soul. The house was quiet. He walked into the living room and stopped in the doorway, the scene before him a powerful, healing balm. Alice was sitting on the floor by Ethan's chair. He was now strong enough to sit in a specialized chair for a few hours each day. She had an old, beautiful acoustic guitar in her lap, an instrument that had belonged to his late wife, and had been gathering dust in a closet for years. She was playing, her fingers moving with a simple, gentle grace, and she was singing. It was a different song this time, a soft, hopeful folk melody. Ethan was awake, his head tilted, his eyes focused on her, completely captivated. Silas stood there, a man living in two irreconcilable worlds, the world of the docks, of traitors and poisons, and this world, a world of healing, of gentleness, of a quiet, beautiful music that was slowly, patiently, coaxing his son back to life. He knew a collision between these two worlds was coming. He now had a real lead on Vinny. The hunt was heating up, and he felt a fierce protective rage build in him. He was no longer just hunting a traitor who had threatened his empire. He was hunting the monster who had tried to silence his son, and who was, by extension, a direct threat to the beautiful, hopeful music that was just beginning to fill his silent house. Vinny, Don Silas Thorne's second-in-command, was a man who prided himself on his patience. He was a creature of the shadows, a master of the long game. But the situation at the Thorne mansion was beginning to test his legendary composure. He had been effectively shut out of the investigation into Ethan's collapse, a clear and insulting signal from his boss. He needed to get a read on the situation to understand the new layout of the battlefield. He arrived at the villa on a Saturday evening for a routine meeting, his senses on high alert. He was led not to the study, but to the grand living room. As he waited, he looked out through the vast glass walls onto the main veranda, and he saw them. Silas and Alice were sitting together at a small table, a game of chess between them. The last of the evening sun cast a warm golden glow over the scene. They were not a boss and an employee. They were two equals, their heads bent close together in an easy, intimate quiet. As he watched, Silas laughed at something she said, a real, relaxed, and unguarded sound. Then Silas reached across the board, and in a gesture that was in no way professional, he placed his hand gently over hers where it rested on a chess piece. She did not pull away. Vinny felt a jolt of pure, cold dread. He was a man who understood power, and he had just witnessed a seismic transfer of it. This was no longer a matter of a grateful boss and a useful employee. This was personal. The Don was falling for the waitress. He analyzed the new reality with a chilling clarity. A grateful boss could be manipulated, could eventually be convinced that the girl was a threat. But a man in love? A man in love was irrational, unpredictable, and above all, fiercely, blindly protective. Alice was no longer a loose end that could be quietly snipped. She was rapidly becoming the new queen in his kingdom, and she, of all people, was the one who had been there in the alley that night, the one person in the world who was a direct, existential threat to his secret. His subsequent meeting with Silas only confirmed his terror. The Don was different. His old sharp predatory focus was gone, replaced by a softer, more distracted air. When Vinny tried to probe for information about the investigation, Silas shut him down with a cold finality. "That is being handled," was all he said, making it perfectly clear that Vinny was no longer in the inner circle. Vinny left the mansion that night, a new, urgent panic coiling in his gut. He had assumed he had time to slowly and subtly poison the well, to create a narrative that would eventually push Alice out. He realized now that he had no time at all. Every day she remained in that house, her influence grew, and the noose around his own neck tightened. He needed to create a crisis so profound and so violent it would shock the soft, sentimental father out of existence and bring the cold, ruthless Don roaring back. A crisis that would remind Silas that his world was a dangerous one, and that in times of danger you turn not to a gentle waitress, but to your most loyal, most ruthless soldier. He sat in his car, parked on a dark, quiet street, overlooking the glittering fortress on the cliff. He looked at the warm, inviting lights of the home, a home he now saw as an enemy stronghold. He had to breach its walls. He had to remind his boss what real fear felt like. He pulled out his phone and made a call to a man who specialized in creating chaos. "The timeline has moved up," Vinny said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I need you to create a problem at the Thorn estate. A big one, this week." While Paolo's dark plot was quietly gathering momentum in the city's shadows, a brilliant, hopeful light was dawning in the Thorn mansion. The one-sided vigil at Ethan's bedside had transformed. It was now a three-person affair. Every evening after dinner, the family would gather in the medical wing. Silas would read from the day's financial news, his voice a low, steady rumble, believing his son could still hear the rhythms of the world he was meant to inherit. And Alice would play the old acoustic guitar, her gentle folk songs a soft, healing balm in the sterile room. They did not know if Ethan could truly hear them, but these nightly rituals were for them as much as for him. They were the quiet, steady work of a family refusing to give up hope. On a beautiful Saturday evening, the three of them were together in his room. The glass doors to the balcony were open, letting in the warm, fragrant air of the spring night. Alice was playing and singing a particularly sweet, hopeful song, a melody about a ship finding its way home in the dark. As she reached a line about following the light, she unconsciously reached out and took Ethan's still, cool hand in her own. And then it happened. As she sang the line, his eyes, which had been closed and still, suddenly fluttered open. They were not the vacant, unseeing eyes of his catatonic state. For a single, breathtaking, miraculous second, they were focused, aware, and they were looking directly at her. His lips, which had been silent for so long, parted. A small, almost inaudible, but distinctly human sound, a breath of a voice, escaped. Alice stopped singing, her own heart stopping with it. Silas, who had been sitting in the armchair, shot forward, his entire body rigid with a sudden electric shock of disbelief. They both saw it. They both heard it. It was a clear, undeniable, and impossible response. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. Ethan's eyes drifted shut again, and he seemed to slip back into his deep, silent state of rest. But something fundamental, something seismic, had shifted in the room. "Did you see that?" Silas whispered, his voice a raw, choked sound of pure, unadulterated awe. His eyes... He looked right at you, Alice. He heard you. The quiet, secret hope they had been so carefully nurturing was no longer a fragile flicker. It was a brilliant, blazing fire. He was in there. He was fighting, and he was close. So close. For the first time, a complete and total recovery did not feel like a foolish fantasy. It felt like an imminent, breathtaking possibility. Tears of pure, triumphant joy streamed down Alice's face. Silas came to her and pulled her into a fierce, tight hug, a shared, explosive moment of hope and relief. "He's coming back to us, Alice," he whispered, his own voice breaking. "He's finally, truly coming home." They held each other, their hearts overflowing with the promise of a miracle, completely, blissfully unaware of the dark reality that was, at that very moment, unfolding just beyond the walls of their happy, hopeful home. The scene cuts abruptly to the outer perimeter wall of the Thorne estate, shrouded in the deep darkness of the night. We see a pair of bolt cutters severing the wires to a high-tech security camera. A moment later, two shadowy figures, dressed all in black, slip silently over the wall and disappear into the lush, manicured gardens. The storm that Paolo had set in motion was about to make landfall. The joyful, tearful embrace in the medical wing was a moment suspended in time, a perfect, brilliant bubble of pure hope. Silas held Alice, his heart overflowing with a gratitude so profound it felt like a prayer. "He's coming back to us, Alice," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He's finally, truly coming home." Outside, in the deep, silent darkness of the manicured gardens, the assassins were moving into position. Their attack was a masterpiece of silent, professional violence. It began not with a bang, but with a sudden, total and unnerving silence. The power to the entire estate was cut. The lights, the soft music playing in the living room, and, most critically, the rhythmic, life-affirming beeps of the monitors in Ethan's room, all of it vanished, plunging the glass fortress into an absolute, disorienting darkness. In that instant, the soft, hopeful father disappeared, and the cold, ruthlessly efficient Don returned. Silas's training, honed over a lifetime of navigating a world of violence, took over. "Alice, get behind me," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl in the darkness. "Don't make a sound." From downstairs they heard it, the sharp, ugly sound of a struggle, a muffled shout, followed by the crash of something heavy breaking. It was a diversion. Silas knew it instantly. The real target was not downstairs. The real target was here. Just as the thought formed in his mind, the large glass door to Ethan's private terrace exploded inward in a shower of shattered glass. A large, dark figure, a man dressed all in black, a silenced pistol in his hand, stepped through the broken frame. What happened next was a blur of pure primal instinct. Silas was already moving, pulling a hidden handgun from a magnetic lock beneath a side table. But he was across the room. He wouldn't be fast enough. The assassin raised his weapon, his target the boy in the bed, the heir to the Thorne Empire and the woman who was the key to his recovery. But Alice did not scream. She did not run. In that split second of life or death, she did not think. She acted. With a fierce, protective cry, she grabbed the one weapon she could find, the heavy, thick glass pitcher of water from Ethan's bedside table. As the intruder took aim, she launched herself forward, placing her own body between the gun and the boy on the bed, a willing, human shield. At the same moment, she swung the heavy pitcher with all the force in her body, crashing it down on the man's outstretched arm. The gun clattered to the marble floor. The man let out a hiss of pure, enraged pain. With a brutal, backhanded shove, he threw her off him. Alice flew backward, her head cracking with a sickening thud against the hard steel frame of the medical bed. And then she crumpled to the floor in a silent, boneless heap. It was in that instant that Silas arrived. He saw the intruder, scrambling for the dropped gun. He saw his son now sitting bolt upright, his eyes wide with a terror that had finally, fully woken him, screaming his father's name. And he saw Alice, a still, silent shape on the floor. A rage, so cold and so absolute it was a force of nature, took over. The fight was brutal, primal, and mercifully short. Silas, with the adrenaline-fueled fury of a father defending his child, disabled the intruder just as his own loyal guards burst into the room. The immediate danger was over. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a cold, clinical glow over the scene of chaos. But the real tragedy was just being revealed. Silas rushed to Alice's side. She was unconscious, a dark, terrible pool of blood beginning to form on the pristine white floor from a wound on the back of her head. He gathered her limp form into his arms, his hands coming away, sticky and wet. "Alice," he breathed, his voice a raw, agonized plea. "Alice, no." Ethan was staring from the bed, his miraculous awakening now a moment of pure, unadulterated horror. The peak of their happiness had been shattered in the most violent way imaginable. In the act of saving his son, Alice had become the latest victim of his dangerous, brutal world. And Silas, who had just found a reason to live again, was now on the verge of losing her forever. The moments that followed were a blur of controlled, violent chaos. The mansion's private medical team, alerted by the silent alarm, swarmed the room. The captured intruder was dragged away by Silas's grim-faced security team. And Silas himself was a caged lion, pacing the sterile white hallway of the medical wing, his hands still stained with Alice's blood, a raw, animalistic rage, and a profound, terrifying fear warring within him. He had brought her into his world. He had promised her his protection. And his world, his brutal, violent, and unforgiving world, had tried to kill her. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating force that left him breathless. The doctors worked on her for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the lead physician, the same Dr. Finch who had once been so dismissive of miracles, came out to meet him. His face was grave. "We've stabilized her, Silas," he said, his voice low. "She has a severe concussion and a skull fracture. We've relieved the pressure, but she is in a deep coma. At this point, it is impossible to say if or when she will wake up." The clinical, hopeless words were a devastating echo of the prognosis he had once given for his son. Silas refused to accept it. He dismissed the nurses and went into her room alone. He sat in the chair beside her bed, in the very position she had occupied for so many weeks beside his son. He looked at her still, pale face, a stark contrast to the vibrant, living woman who had brought so much color back into his life. He took her limp, cool hand in his own, and he began his vigil. A short time later, the quiet whir of a wheelchair made him look up. Ethan was in the doorway, his face pale and determined. A trusted nurse stood behind him. Without a word, the boy wheeled himself to the other side of Alice's bed. Father and son, now united in a new, terrible and silent vigil. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft, rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Finally, Silas could bear it no longer. He leaned close to Alice, his voice a raw, desperate and broken plea. "Alice," he whispered, his voice cracking, "listen to me. You have to wake up. You have to come back. I was a fool. I brought you into this darkness and I let it hurt you. But I need you. You are the light in this house. You are my light." He squeezed her hand, his tears falling freely now. "I love you, Alice. Please, please, come back to us." Ethan listened to his father's desperate, loving words. He looked at Alice's still face. He looked at the woman who had sat by his bed for weeks, whose gentle voice and quiet songs had been the lifeline that had pulled him back from his own silent, dark abyss. A new, powerful, and fiercely protective emotion surged through him. It was his turn. He reached out and took her other hand. He, the boy who had been trapped in silence, would be the one to call her back. His voice was still weak, still rusty from years of disuse. But it was clear, and it was filled with a desperate, loving, and absolute command. "Alice," he said, "wake up." There was no immediate miracle. Her eyes did not flutter open. But at the sound of his voice, a single, sharp, and undeniable beep came from the monitor that was tracking her brain activity. A vibrant green line on the screen, which had been a slow, steady wave, suddenly, for a brief, electric moment, spiked. The doctor, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, rushed into the room, his eyes wide with a stunned new excitement. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a disbelieving whisper as he pointed to the screen. "Did you see that? That was a significant increase in cortical activity. Your son, I think she heard him." Silas looked from the screen to his son and then back to the woman in the bed. A new, fragile, and utterly desperate hope ignited in the darkness of his despair. The boy who had been saved by a whisper had now, with a single spoken word, become the potential savior. Their vigil was no longer just one of grief. It was now a vigil of active, desperate hope. The days that followed were a quiet, tense, and deeply hopeful vigil. A new routine formed in the private medical wing of the Thorne mansion. Silas and Ethan became a steadfast, two-person team, their entire world shrinking to the quiet, beeping confines of Alice's room. They took turns sitting by her bedside, reading to her, talking to her, and playing the soft folk music she loved, clinging to the small, hopeful spikes on the brain activity monitor as proof that she was still in there, fighting her way back to them. The bond between father and son, forged in shared fear and a new shared purpose, deepened into something powerful and unbreakable. They were partners in hope. Meanwhile, the hunt for the truth continued in the darker corners of the house. The man who had attacked Alice, a professional killer with no official identity, was being held in the mansion's secure basement. He was a stone wall, revealing nothing under interrogation. Silas knew the man was just a soldier, a tool. The real question, the one that tormented his every waking moment, was who had sent him. The answer, he knew, was locked away in the one place he couldn't access: his own son's traumatic memory. The key to that lock, as always, was Alice. One afternoon, Ethan was sitting by her bedside, holding her still, unresponsive hand in his own. He was talking to her, a one-sided conversation that had become his own form of therapy. He was telling her about the diner, about the first time he had seen her, about the quiet kindness in her eyes that had made him feel for the first time like a normal person and not just the estranged son of a Mafia boss. And as he spoke, as he walked the path of his own memory back to that fateful night, the fog in his mind began to clear. The fragments of that terrible evening, which had been a blur of fear and confusion, began to snap into a sharp, horrifying focus. He remembered the feeling of dizziness in the alley. He remembered fumbling for his phone to call his father. And then he remembered. Silas entered the room to find his son sitting bolt upright, his face pale, his eyes wide with a look of dawning absolute horror. "Ethan?" he said, a surge of alarm going through him. "What is it? What do you remember?" Ethan looked up at his father, his voice a raw, trembling whisper. "I remember," he said. "The alley. I was dizzy. I was falling. And then, Vinny was there." The name hung in the silent, sterile room like a poison. "So I said he was just checking on me," Ethan continued, the memory now a torrent. "He acted so concerned. He said I looked pale, that I needed a drink to steady my nerves." He looked at his father, his eyes now full of a terrible, clear-eyed certainty. "He offered me a drink, from his own silver flask. He said it would help." "I was so disoriented I didn't think," Ethan whispered. "I trusted him. I took a small sip, and then I smelled it." He looked at his father, his face crumpling with the memory of the betrayal. Bitter almonds. The world went dark. It was him, Dad. It was always him. The final, ugly and undeniable piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The testimony was delivered. The traitor was named. Silas stood there, his face a mask of cold, murderous rage. His own lieutenant, the man he had trusted for years, the man who had stood by his side as they had hunted for a faceless enemy, had been the monster all along. He had tried to kill his son, and he had almost succeeded in letting this innocent, beautiful woman take the fall for it. He looked down at Alice's still, peaceful face. The debt he owed her was now immeasurable. She hadn't just saved his son once in the alley. She had, with her quiet compassion, saved him again and again and had taken a blow that was meant for his own family. The time for quiet, secret investigation was over. The time for judgment had come. He turned and walked out of the room, a look of calm, absolute and lethal purpose on his face. Silas Thorne moved with the quiet, lethal purpose of a man whose world had just been brought into a sharp and terrible focus. His son's testimony was the key, the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. The time for secret investigation was over. The time for judgment had come. He did not summon Vinny to the gleaming, glass-walled mansion. That was his home, a place he was now determined to keep clean from the filth of his business. Instead, he sent a simple, coded message. Warehouse 7, 9 p.m. Urgent. Warehouse 7 was a vast, cavernous and empty space on the Boston docks, a place reserved for the most serious of family business. When Vinny arrived, he found the warehouse lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the high ceiling, casting long, dancing shadows. Silas was sitting on a simple wooden crate in the center of the vast, empty floor, waiting for him. Two of Silas's oldest and most loyal capos stood like statues in the deep shadows by the door. Vinny knew in that instant that this was not a meeting. It was a trial. "Boss," Vinny began, his voice trying for its usual easy confidence, but the word came out as a nervous croak. "My son woke up, Vinny," Silas said, his voice a quiet, conversational tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "He remembers everything." The color drained from Vinny's face. He began to stammer, to deny, to bluff. "The boy is confused, Silas. He's been through a terrible trauma. He doesn't know what He remembers the flask, Vinny," Silas continued, his voice as cold and as flat as the concrete floor. "He remembers you telling him it would steady his nerves. He remembers the smell, bitter almonds." He stood up from the crate and began to walk slowly toward his second-in-command. "I have the report from the chemist you met with. I have the security logs from the house showing your movements. And I have the testimony of my own son." He stopped just in front of Vinny. There is nowhere left to hide. Trapped, exposed, and with the certainty of his own doom closing in, Vinny's fear finally erupted into a defiant, pathetic rage. "You were getting soft," he snarled, his voice a venomous hiss. "That woman, that broken boy, they were turning you into a civilian, a husband, a father. You were forgetting what it takes to run this family, to hold this city. I did what I did to protect the legacy your father built, to protect us from you." Silas listened to the treacherous, self-serving justification, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. "You did not do this for my family," he said, his voice a low, deadly whisper. "You tried to kill my son. You tried to frame an innocent woman for your crime. You have broken the one sacred rule of our world. You do not bring the war into the home." He looked at Vinny, a man he had once trusted like a brother, with nothing but a cold, profound disgust. "You will not die," Silas said, and for a fleeting, insane moment, Vinny felt a flicker of hope. "That would be too easy. A mercy you have not earned." "You will live," Silas continued, his judgment absolute and final. "But you will have nothing. As of this moment, your money is no longer your own. Your power is gone. Your name is now a whisper of a ghost in this city. You will leave this country tonight, and you will spend the rest of your miserable, empty life as a nobody, looking over your shoulder every single day, wondering if this is the day your sins have finally come to collect their debt." He gave a slight nod to the men in the shadows. "Now, get out of my sight." The loyal capos stepped forward and took Vinny by the arms, dragging the now broken, trembling man out of the warehouse and out of Silas's life forever. Silas was left alone in the vast, empty space, the sounds of the Boston harbor drifting in from outside. He felt a grim, final sense of closure. He had just exercised the old brutal power of his father's world one last time, not for greed or for territory, but to protect the new, gentle world he had found. He pulled out his phone. He looked at a picture Alice had sent him just an hour before, a picture of Ethan sitting up in his chair. A small, tired but real smile on his face. The last of his father's ghosts had been dealt with. The war was over. He had finally, truly, made his home safe. And now he could go back to it. While justice, swift and cold, was being served in the darkness of the Boston docks, a quiet, hopeful vigil continued in the sunlit medical wing of the Thorne mansion. Silas and Ethan had become a steadfast two-person team, their entire world shrinking to the quiet, beeping confines of Alice's room. They took turns sitting by her bedside, reading to her, talking to her, and playing the soft folk music she loved, clinging to the small, hopeful spikes on the brain activity monitor, as proof that she was still in there, fighting her way back to them. The bond between father and son, forged in shared fear and a new shared purpose, deepened into something powerful and unbreakable. They were partners in hope. Alice's first sensation of her return to the world was sound. First, the soft, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, a steady, reassuring beat. Then a low, murmuring voice, a voice she knew, full of a deep, gentle warmth. It was Silas. He was reading. And underneath his voice there was another, younger voice, adding a quiet comment, a question. It was Ethan. The sound of his voice, clear and awake, was the thing that finally, gently, pulled her from the deep, grey fog. She fought her way toward the voices, a swimmer fighting her way to the surface. Her eyelids felt as heavy as lead doors. With a monumental, groaning effort, she forced them open. The light was soft, the view a blurry watercolor. As the world slowly sharpened into focus, she saw that she was in the clean, white medical room. And then she saw them. Silas was in a chair on one side of her bed, his head in his hands, looking down at a book, his expression one of deep, weary concentration as he read aloud. And on the other side of the bed, in another chair, sat Ethan. He was not in a bed, he was not unconscious. He was awake, he was alert, and he was listening intently, a look of quiet intelligence on his face. Her mind, still clouded, struggled to process the impossible scene. The last thing she remembered was a dark figure, a glint of metal, a flash of searing pain, and Ethan, silent and still in his bed. Now he was awake. He was whole. It didn't make sense. She made a small sound, a dry, weak noise in the back of her throat. Both heads snapped up. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of pure, disbelieving and overwhelming relief. Ethan's own face broke into a brilliant, tearful smile. "Alice," Silas breathed, his voice choked with an emotion so powerful it was almost painful. "You're awake." "We were waiting for you," Ethan added, his own voice, a sound she had only ever heard in a dream, now a miraculous living thing. Gently, quickly, Silas explained what she had missed. He told her about Ethan's miraculous, full awakening, about the memory that had returned, and the testimony that had been his salvation. He told her about Vinny's betrayal and his banishment. He told her she was safe, that the nightmare was finally completely over. She listened, completely stunned, as tears of her own, tears of shock, of relief, of a joy so profound it was a physical ache, began to stream down her face. She looked at Ethan, at this beautiful, healed boy, and then she looked at Silas, at the raw, unguarded love and boundless gratitude shining in his eyes. Silas took one of her hands. Ethan reached out and took the other. They were a complete, unbroken circle, a small, powerful trinity of survivors. A nurse appeared in the doorway, saw the scene, and with a wise, knowing smile, quietly backed out, closing the door to give them their private, perfect moment. Alice lay in the bed, weak and aching, but her heart was overflowing. She had come to this house as a simple waitress, and in the course of a few terrifying weeks, she had been a witness, a prisoner, and a target. But she had woken up to discover that she had also somehow become a hero. And as she looked at the two men, the father and the son, holding her hands as if she were the most precious thing in their entire world, she knew with an absolute and joyful certainty that she had finally and truly woken up at home. The week that followed Alice's awakening was a time of quiet, gentle healing. She recovered in a beautiful sun-drenched suite, the doors to the veranda left open to the warm, salt-scented spring air. The roles in the house had been completely and beautifully reversed. She, who had been the tireless caregiver, was now the one being cared for. Ethan, now fully verbal and his memory clear, became her devoted protector. He would spend hours by her bedside, reading to her from the same adventure novels she had once read to him. He would insist on helping the nurse bring her meal trays, his small, serious face a mask of loving concentration. He had been given a second chance at life, and he was determined to pour all of his newfound energy into caring for the woman who had made it possible. And Silas was simply and constantly there. He had delegated the running of his entire empire to his most trusted men. His world for now had shrunk to the quiet confines of this house, to the slow, steady, and miraculous rhythm of healing. He was no longer the Don, no longer the investigator. He was just a man, watching the woman he loved slowly come back to him. One evening, after Ethan was finally asleep, Silas found Alice sitting on her private balcony, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the first stars begin to appear in the twilight sky. He came and sat in the chair beside her. "The police were here," he said quietly. "They took the final statement from the man who broke in. With his testimony and Ethan's, Vinny's fate is sealed. He will not be a problem for anyone, ever again." "And the other world?" she asked, her voice a soft, hesitant whisper. "The Carbonis? The danger?" He looked out at the peaceful, darkening sea. "That world is dying, Alice," he said, his voice full of a new, firm resolve. "I'm ending it. I am in the process of selling off the parts of my business that live in the shadows. I am building something new, something legitimate, something a man can be proud to leave to his son." He turned to her. "I am building a world that is safe enough for you." She looked at him, at this powerful, dangerous man who was willingly for her, changing the entire foundation of his life. He took her hand, his touch gentle. "When you first came here," he began, his voice full of a quiet wonder, "I saw you as a puzzle, a key to the mystery of my son. Then, as I watched you with him, I saw you as a miracle, a healer. And when you were hurt," he said, his voice cracking slightly with the memory, "I saw you as a precious, fragile thing that I had almost lost." He squeezed her hand, his gaze intense and full of a raw, honest emotion. "But now, Alice, sitting here with you, with all the ghosts finally at rest, I just see you. The strong, the brave, the kind, the incredible woman I have fallen completely and irrevocably in love with." The confession, so simple and so absolute, hung in the warm, fragrant air between them. Her own heart, which she had guarded for so long, felt a final, happy, and total surrender. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate relief or of triumphant passion. It was a quiet, certain, and deeply loving kiss, a kiss of two people who had been through a terrible, violent war together and had, against all odds, found a lasting peace on the other side. When they parted, they just sat there, hand in hand, in the comfortable, perfect silence of the evening. The vigil was over. The investigation was over. The danger was past. All that was left was the quiet, beautiful, and sometimes scary work of building a new life, together. In the weeks that followed, Alice recovered, her physical wounds healing under the constant, gentle care of Silas and a now attentive Ethan. Her new life was a surreal dream. She was no longer a prisoner, but the cherished lady of the house, her every need attended to, her every wish granted. She, Silas, and Ethan had become a small, fiercely loving and inseparable family unit. And yet, as her body healed, a small, persistent ache remained in her heart. It was the ache of fear. The conversation she had been dreading happened one beautiful spring evening on the veranda. Silas was talking about the future, about their future, with an easy, happy confidence. He spoke of her moving her things into the master suite, of them redecorating, of what their life together would look like. She finally found the courage to voice the fear that had been haunting her. "Silas," she began, her voice a low, hesitant whisper, "I love you, and I love Ethan more than words can say, but I'm terrified." He looked at her, his happy expression giving way to a quiet, serious concern. "Of what?" "Of this," she said, gesturing vaguely to the silent, imposing house, to the guards who still patrolled the perimeter. "Of your world. I saw what it did to me. I saw what it almost did to Ethan. I'm a waitress from a diner in Boston. I don't know how to live in a world of assassins and bodyguards. I don't want Ethan to have to grow up in it. How can we ever have a normal, safe life?" The old Silas might have been offended. He might have tried to reassure her with empty promises of more security, of more walls. But the new Silas, the man who had been so profoundly changed by her and by his son, simply listened. And he understood. "You're right," he said quietly. "You can't. Not in the world as it is." He stood up and took her hand. "Come with me. There is something I need to show you." He led her to his study. He sat her down in his large leather chair and opened his laptop. For the next hour, he didn't just tell her. He showed her. He showed her the complex legal documents that detailed the sale and dissolution of the most dangerous and illicit parts of his father's empire. He showed her the corporate charters for a series of new, completely legitimate real estate and global logistics companies he was building from the ground up. He showed her architectural plans for a new state-of-the-art and completely legal port facility that would be the new heart of the Thorne family business. "This is my promise to you, Alice," he said, his voice full of a new kind of power, the quiet, steady power of a creator, not a destroyer. "I am not just stepping away from my father's world. I am dismantling it, piece by piece. It will take time, and the transition will have its own dangers, but I will do it. I am building a new legacy, Alice, a legitimate one, a business that our son can one day inherit with pride, not with fear. A life that you and I can finally feel safe in." He turned to her, his heart in his eyes. "This is not just my world anymore. It is our world, and we will build it together in the light." She looked at him, at the incredible, tangible, and undeniable proof of his commitment spread across the screen. He wasn't just saying he would change. He was actively, methodically, and brilliantly changing his entire world for her, for them. Her last lingering fear, her final protective hesitation, was completely and finally washed away. She leaned forward and pointed to a detail on the architectural plans. "The community impact assessment for that port," she said, her voice now steady and full of a new, shared purpose. "We'll need to make sure it's thorough." He smiled, a look of profound love and admiration on his face. They were no longer just a couple in love. They were partners in the truest and most complete sense of the word, the co-architects of a new, safer, and better future. The difficult choice was no longer hers alone to fear. It was a shared, hopeful mission they had just in that moment begun together. The months that followed were a testament to the quiet, steady, and sometimes difficult work of building a new world. Silas, true to his word, began the arduous process of dismantling his father's shadowy empire and rebuilding it, piece by legitimate piece, in the light. It was a complex and dangerous undertaking, but with Alice as his quiet, steady, and moral compass, he never wavered. Their partnership, forged in crisis, was now being solidified in the shared, creative work of building a future. One person, however, knew that there was one final, essential piece of construction yet to be done. Ethan, now almost fully recovered, a young man with a quiet confidence that belied the trauma he had survived, went to his father. "You love her," he stated, his observation simple and direct. "And she loves you. So, what are you waiting for?" Silas looked at his son, at his wise old soul eyes, and he smiled. "I was waiting for the right partner to help me plan the operation," he said. The proposal became their secret, shared mission. Ethan, with his artistic, romantic spirit, was the architect. It could not be a grand, flashy display of wealth, he insisted. It had to be personal. It had to tell their story. He decided on the location, the alley behind the Beacon Diner. Silas was taken aback. "The alley? Ethan, that's a place of terrible memories." "No, Dad," Ethan had replied, his wisdom stunning his father into silence. "It's not. It's the place where Alice saved my life. It's the place where our real story began. We just have to redecorate it." And so they did. After getting the diner owner's bemused permission, Silas and Ethan spent a whole Saturday afternoon transforming the grimy, forgotten space. They had the brick walls professionally cleaned. They hung dozens of strings of warm, glowing fairy lights, crisscrossing them from one wall to the other. They filled the space with dozens of large, beautiful potted plants and spring flowers, their fragrance chasing away the old, stale smells of the city. They turned a place of urban decay into a secret, magical grotto. That evening, Silas told Alice he needed to take her somewhere. He drove her not to a fancy restaurant, but back to her old, familiar neighborhood. When he led her down the narrow, dark alley, she felt a flicker of the old fear return. And then she saw it, The alley was no longer dark and menacing. It was a breathtaking, magical space, glowing with the light of 1,000 tiny stars. In the very spot where she had found his son, unconscious and near death, there now stood a small candlelit table for two. He led her to that spot, and then he got down on one knee. "This is where our story began, Alice," he said, his voice raw with an emotion that was as deep and as true as the night sky above them. "In the darkest, ugliest place, you chose to be a light. You chose compassion over fear. You found my son, and you saved him, and in doing so, you saved me." He took out a small velvet box and opened it. Inside, a simple, elegant diamond glittered, catching the light of the fairy lights. "I can't promise you a life without shadows," he said, his heart in his eyes. "But I can promise to spend the rest of my life standing in the light with you. Alice, my beautiful, brave, and incredible Alice, will you marry me?" She was crying, silent, happy tears streaming down her face, completely overwhelmed by the profound, beautiful, and perfect symbolism of his gesture. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Silas, of course, yes." As he slid the ring onto her finger, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the diner's back door. It was Ethan, a single perfect red rose in his hand. He walked over and presented it to Alice, a proud, happy smile on his face, the architect of this perfect secret moment. The three of them came together in a group hug in the middle of the transformed, magical alley. The place of their greatest fear had been reclaimed, and it was now forever the site of their greatest joy. They had not erased their dark beginning. They had honored it, and in doing so had proven that even in the ugliest of places, the most beautiful and most hopeful of things can grow. In the quiet, happy months that followed their engagement, a new sense of normalcy settled over the Thorne mansion. The ghosts of the past had been banished, the threats neutralized. What was left was the beautiful, simple, and sometimes chaotic work of being a family. Alice's recovery was complete, and she was now the undisputed loving heart of the home. The most profound transformation, however, was in Ethan. The pale, haunted, and paranoid young man who had huddled in the back of a lonely diner was gone forever. In his place was a confident, healthy, and thoughtful man in his early 20s. He was still quiet by nature, but his silence was no longer a fortress of fear. It was a comfortable, contemplative peace. He was enrolled in community college courses, his sharp mind finally free to engage with the world. One evening, the three of them were having dinner on the veranda, a comfortable, easy ritual that had become the anchor of their days. Silas, now looking toward the future, brought up a topic he had been considering. "We're breaking ground on the new legitimate port facility next month, Ethan," he said, a note of paternal pride in his voice. "I was thinking when you've finished your current semester, you could come on as an intern, start to learn the ropes of the family business from the ground up." It was a well-intentioned offer, the natural assumption of a father to his heir. Ethan put down his fork. He looked at his father and then at Alice, and he gave them a small, confident smile. "Dad," he began, his voice calm but with a new, firm certainty, "I love you. And I am more grateful than I can ever say for everything you've done. But that's your world, your empire, it's not mine." He took a breath, and for the first time gave voice to the dream that had been quietly taking root in his own heart. "I don't want to run a shipping company, I want to cook." Silas stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Cook?" "Yes," Ethan said, his passion for the subject making his eyes light up. "When I was living on my own, the only place I ever felt a real sense of community, of life, was in the back of that diner. Watching the cooks, the controlled chaos, the way they took simple ingredients and made something that made people happy." He looked at Alice. "I want to do that. I want to go to culinary school. I want to be a chef." A year ago, Silas would have been furious. He would have seen it as a rejection, an insult to the powerful legacy he was trying to build for his son. But he was not that man anymore. He was a father who had almost lost his son, a man who had learned that a child's happiness was the only legacy that truly mattered. He looked at his son, truly saw him, not as an heir, but as his own man, with his own passions. He saw that Ethan's dream was not a rejection of him, but a brave embrace of a normal, happy, and beautifully ordinary life, the very thing he had fought so hard to be able to give him. A slow, proud smile spread across his face. "The chef," he said, a note of wonder and of absolute pride in his voice. "Okay, then you will be the best damn chef this city has ever seen. We'll get you into the best school in the world. Le Cordon Bleu in Paris. We'll build you a restaurant when you're ready." "No, Dad," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't want you to build me a restaurant. Not yet. I want to earn one. I just need to start at the beginning." Later that evening, Silas stood in the doorway of the kitchen. Ethan was there with Alice. He was excitedly showing her a complex recipe in a French cookbook, and she was listening, her expression one of pure maternal pride. Silas watched them, and his heart was so full of a quiet, profound love, it was almost a physical ache. He realized that his greatest success as a man was not in building an empire for his son to inherit. His greatest success was in raising a son who was strong enough and brave enough to walk away from it, to choose his own path, to choose passion over power. He had not raised an heir, he had raised a good man, and that he knew was a far greater and far more valuable legacy. With Ethan's future now set on a course of his own choosing, a new and final kind of peace settled over the Thorne household. The great, dramatic battles had been fought and won. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. What remained was the quiet, beautiful and sometimes wonderfully mundane work of being a family. Their new life was a tapestry woven from small, ordinary moments of joy. It was the three of them, crowded together in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, with Ethan now proudly in charge of making a ridiculously complicated brunch recipe, a happy, chaotic mess of flour and laughter. It was a lazy afternoon spent at a local park, the three of them trying and failing to get a brightly colored kite to fly, their shared frustration dissolving into helpless, easy laughter. It was in the quiet moments that the change was most profound. One evening, the three of them were sitting on a bench in their garden, eating ice cream as the sun set, the sky a brilliant explosion of spring color. They weren't talking about the past or about the great, ambitious plans for the future. They were having a very serious and very silly debate about what kind of dog they should get. A golden retriever, Ethan argued. They're classic, loyal. A beagle, Alice countered, a playful glint in her eye. They're full of personality and they're always getting into trouble. Silas, who had never owned a pet in his life, just listened, a look of profound, quiet contentment on his face. This simple, domestic and utterly normal conversation was a sound he had never thought he would hear in his own home. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. As they walked back toward the house in the fading twilight, Ethan, who was walking between them, talking excitedly about his plans for his own restaurant one day, did something completely natural and unthinking. He reached out and took his father's hand. Silas's heart clenched with a familiar, beautiful ache. He looked at his son and then at Alice, who was walking on his other side. He reached out his free hand and took hers, and for a moment the three of them were all linked, a single, unbreakable chain, walking together toward the warm, welcoming lights of their home. Silas looked at his family, at the two incredible people who had so completely and so beautifully resurrected his world. He felt the warm, solid connection of their linked hands. He thought of the cold, lonely and violent power he had once wielded, a power that had brought him a fortune, but had cost him his soul. He realized then that this, the simple, quiet and profound strength of a family holding hands as they walked home together at the end of a perfect ordinary day, was the only kind of power that had ever truly mattered. They were married on a perfect evening in the heart of a warm New England summer, not in a grand cavernous cathedral, but in the intimacy of their own backyard, on a lawn overlooking the calm, glittering expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The guest list was small, a carefully curated collection of the new, honest world they had built together. A few of Silas's now legitimate business partners and their families mingled with Alice's tearfully proud friends from the Beacon Diner. The household staff were not working. They were honored guests, celebrating the family they had come to love. In the quiet moments before the ceremony, Alice was in her suite, a vision in a simple but breathtakingly elegant ivory dress. There was a soft knock on the door. It was Ethan. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, no longer a boy, but a handsome and confident young man. He was holding a small, gift-wrapped box. "I have something for you," he said, his voice a little shy. She opened it. Inside was not a piece of jewelry, but his own well-worn copy of the old adventure novel she had read to him day after day when he was lost in the darkness. On the inside cover, he had written a simple, heartfelt inscription: "To Alice. Thank you for reading me back to life. I love you, Mum." The last, final, and most beautiful piece of her new life clicked into place. She pulled her new son into a fierce, tearful hug. The ceremony itself was a testament to their journey. Ethan stood beside his father as the best man, a living, breathing miracle, his presence the ultimate symbol of their shared victory. Silas's vows were a raw, public confession of his own transformation. "I was a man who lived in a fortress," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Alice. "A fortress of power, of wealth, and of a deep, profound grief. I thought those walls were keeping me safe, but they were just keeping me a prisoner. You, Alice, with your quiet, unshakable courage, you walked into my fortress and you tore it down, stone by stone. You did not just save my son's life, you saved my soul. I promise to spend my new and legitimate life being a man who is worthy of you." Alice's own vows were a whisper of gratitude. "I was a girl who was just trying to survive," she said, her eyes shining with love. "I found a boy in an alley, and I made a call that terrified me. But it was the call that led me home. You and Ethan, you gave me a home in the most unlikely of places, and a love I never thought I deserved. I promise to always be the heart of that home, for all of my days." Their first dance as husband and wife was to a soft, simple melody on a small dance floor under the emerging stars. After a minute, Ethan joined them, and the three of them moved together in a slow, happy, and perfect circle. Later, as the party continued with easy laughter and soft music, the new family slipped away for a moment. They stood together at the edge of the great lawn, looking out at the dark, peaceful ocean, the sound of their party a happy murmur behind them. They were not looking back at the dark, dangerous past. They were looking forward together at the endless, beautiful, and hopeful horizon. The waitress who had made a terrifying phone call, the boy who had been lost in the darkness, and the Mafia boss who had only known a world of violence. They were all gone. In their place stood a family, whole, healed, and at peace, their future as bright and as limitless as the sea. The months following their wedding were a quiet, purposeful dismantling of an empire. Silas, true to the promise he had made to Alice and to himself, began the long, difficult, and sometimes dangerous process of legitimizing his world. The Thorne family business, a sprawling and shadowy enterprise built by his father on a foundation of fear and intimidation, was to be reborn. His study, once a dark, intimidating chamber where he ruled as a don, was transformed. It was now a bright, open, shared workspace, the large mahogany desk replaced by two elegant facing desks, one for him and one for Alice. It was from this new headquarters of light and partnership that he began his revolution. He called a final, formal meeting of the heads of all his family's old enterprises, the old guard, the hard-faced men who had been loyal to his father's brutal code, gathered in the mansion's formal dining room. They were expecting to discuss a new strategy for dealing with the encroaching Carbone family. Instead, they were met with the end of their world. Silas stood before them, not as their don, but as the chairman of a new corporation. Alice was at his side, a quiet, steady, and powerful presence. "The old ways are over," he announced, his voice calm, clear, and absolute. "I am dissolving our family's interests in any and all grey market enterprises. The Thorne name will no longer be associated with the shadows. We are moving completely into the light." He laid out his offer. It was a choice between the past and the future. "For your years of loyalty," he said, "each of you will be offered a severance package so generous it will secure your families for life. You can take it, retire, and disappear. No questions asked." He paused, his gaze sweeping over their stunned faces. "Or you can stay. You can become a partner in the new Thorne Holdings, a completely legitimate global real estate and logistics company, but you will do so as a legitimate partner, investing your own capital and you will abide by a new code, a code of law, of transparency, and of integrity. The room was a tense, shocked silence. A few of the older, harder men whose identities were inextricably linked to the old ways of violence, scoffed, their expressions full of a bitter contempt. They took the severance, but others, the younger men with families of their own, men who were tired of a life spent looking over their shoulders, saw what he was offering, a way out, a chance at a real, peaceful future. They stayed. After the tense, revolutionary meeting was over, Silas and Alice stood on the veranda, the early evening air cool and fresh. "I just made some powerful enemies," he said, his voice a low murmur. She took his hand. "No," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unwavering faith in him. "You just chose new friends. You chose a better future. And I have never been more proud of you." The new era began the following week, with the first official board meeting of the new, leaner, but completely legitimate Thorn Holdings. They did not meet to discuss turf wars or rivals. They met to discuss their first major project, a partnership with the city to build a new, high-quality and affordable housing development in a struggling neighborhood. Silas sat at the head of the conference table, his wife, Alice, the newest member of his board, at his side. He looked at the faces around him, the few loyal men who had chosen to step into the light with him. He looked at the architectural plans for the new development, a project that would build homes, not break them. He had traded a large, powerful empire built on fear for a smaller, better one built on a foundation of hope. And he knew, with a certainty that filled his entire being, that it was the only legacy he was proud to one day leave to his son. The months following the wedding were a time of profound and deeply peaceful change. With the dark, complicated machinery of his father's old empire being dismantled and rebuilt into something legitimate, Ethan found himself with a gift he had never had before: the freedom to choose his own life. With a quiet, steady passion that delighted his parents, he threw himself into his culinary ambitions. He was accepted into Boston's most prestigious culinary institute for the fall semester. The night before he was due to move into his own small, simple apartment near the school, the family had one final dinner together at the Thorn Mansion. But this time, Ethan was not a guest at the table. He was the chef. The magnificent, state-of-the-art kitchen, once a place he had barely entered, was now his domain. He moved with a new, focused confidence, a chef in his element. Alice was his happy, willing sous chef, chopping vegetables and taking his playfully serious commands. And Silas, in a beautiful role reversal, was the wine steward, comically swirling a glass and asking his son for a pairing recommendation for the magnificent meal he was preparing. At the end of the dinner, a culinary triumph that left them all breathless, Silas presented his son with a gift. It was not a new car or a blank check. It was a long, narrow wooden box. Ethan opened it. Inside, nestled on worn, faded velvet, was a set of old, beautifully crafted professional kitchen knives, their carbon steel blades worn but perfectly sharpened, their wooden handles smooth with age. "These belong to your grandmother," Silas said, his voice quiet and full of a fond, distant memory he had never shared before. "My mother. She was not a wealthy woman. She was a cook, the best in our entire neighborhood in the North End. She always dreamed of opening her own small restaurant, a place where she could just feed people and make them happy." He looked at his son, his eyes full of a pride so deep it was almost painful. "She would have been so proud of you, Ethan." It was a profound moment of connection, a blessing. Silas was not just giving his son a set of knives. He was connecting him, not to the dark, violent legacy of the Thorn men, but to the gentle, life-affirming and creative legacy of his grandmother. The next day they helped him move into his new apartment. It was a small third-floor walk-up in a noisy, vibrant neighborhood, a world away from the silent, manicured perfection of the Thorn estate. But it was his. It was the first space in his life that was completely and totally his own. After the last box was unpacked, it was time for them to go. Silas stood in the center of the small, simple room, a sudden, familiar wave of paternal worry washing over him. "Are you sure you'll be okay here, son?" he asked, his voice a little rough. Ethan smiled, a confident, easy, and completely adult smile. "Dad," he said, and the simple word was full of their entire, shared and hard-won history. "I've been through worse." He walked over and gave his father a hug, not the hug of a boy seeking comfort, but the hug of an equal, of a man. Later, Silas and Alice stood on the sidewalk outside, looking up at the window of their son's new apartment. He was there, a silhouette in the warm yellow light waving down at them. He was on his own. He was independent. And he was, for the first time, the author of his own story. Silas watched him, and he realized then that his greatest success, his true legacy, was not the empire he was rebuilding. It was the good, strong, and independent man his son had become. He had not just raised an heir, he had raised a person, and that, he knew, was a far greater and far more valuable accomplishment. The months that followed were a testament to the quiet, steady, and sometimes difficult work of building a new world. Ethan thrived at culinary school, his passion and talent undeniable. And Silas, true to his word, continued the arduous process of dismantling his father's shadowy empire and rebuilding it piece by legitimate piece, in the light. The first great public unveiling of this new Thorn Holdings came on a bright, crisp autumn day in a formerly blighted, forgotten neighborhood in Boston. It was the grand opening of the Alcott, the company's first major legitimate real estate venture, a beautiful, safe, and high-quality affordable housing complex. The event was not a stuffy, corporate affair. It was a community block party, a celebration for the new residents. And the entire Thorn family was there, not as distant benefactors, but as active, joyful participants. Ethan, along with a team of his fellow culinary students, was in charge of the food, serving a magnificent free barbecue for hundreds of people. His journey had come full circle. The boy who was found near a diner was now using his own hard-won skills to feed a community. Alice, who had been an integral part of the project's design committee, ensuring it had beautiful green spaces and a state-of-the-art playground, was in the center of that playground, pushing a laughing child on a swing. And Silas was simply walking through the crowd, shaking hands, listening to the stories of the new residents. At one point, he was approached by an old associate from his father's time, a man whose face was a hard map of the violent world Silas had left behind. "I never thought I'd see the day, Silas," the man said, a cynical sneer on his lips as he looked at the happy, chaotic scene. "Trading turf wars for ribbon cuttings. Your father would be rolling in his grave." Silas looked at the man, and then he looked out at the scene before him. He saw the children playing safely on the new grass. He saw his own son, his face full of a proud, focused joy as he served a plate of food. He saw his wife, her smile the brightest thing in the entire world. He turned back to the man from his past, and his own smile was one of complete and utter peace. "You're right, Frankie," he said, his voice calm and sure. "This is a different kind of power, and it's a hell of a lot better." Later, during the formal ribbon-cutting ceremony, he stood in the crowd holding Alice's hand. He was not the one on the stage. He had given that honor to one of the new resident families. He watched as a young mother and her two small children, their faces beaming, cut the big red ribbon, officially opening their new home. He looked at the beautiful, hopeful building. He looked at the happy, thriving community celebrating around him. He felt a sense of pride and a profound accomplishment that was 1,000 times deeper and more real than any victory he had ever achieved in his old life. He was not just building buildings, he was building communities. He was building a legacy of hope. He had finally learned a new and far, far better kind of power. The sizzle of garlic in hot olive oil was the first sound to break the peaceful morning silence of the lake house. Ethan, a chef's towel tucked into the waistband of his jeans, moved with an easy, practiced confidence in the rustic kitchen. "Dad, I need you to chop the parsley," he commanded, his voice full of a playful, newfound authority. "And please try not to bruise it this time." Silas Thorn, the man who had once commanded a criminal empire, dutifully took the bunch of parsley and began to chop, his movements comically clumsy and oversized for the delicate task. "I make no promises," he said with a grin. From her seat at the large wooden kitchen table, a sketchbook open in front of her, Alice watched the two of them, her heart full. This was their first real family vacation, a quiet week in a rustic house nestled in the mountains of New Hampshire. It was a world away from the pressures of Boston, a place for them to simply be. The afternoon was spent out on the still, quiet waters of the lake. Silas, an expert fisherman in his youth, tried to teach his son the art of casting a line. But it was Alice, who had never held a fishing rod in her life, who ended up catching the biggest fish of the day, a beautiful, glistening bass that she reeled in with a shriek of surprised delight, much to the amusement of her two boys. That evening, they sat together on the screened-in porch as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple over the lake. They ate the magnificent meal that Ethan had prepared, the very fish that Alice had so proudly caught. The conversation was easy and full of laughter. It was not about the past or about the great ambitious plans for the future. It was about the simple, beautiful, and perfect day they had just shared. Silas raised his glass of wine. "A toast," he said, his voice full of a deep, quiet gratitude that seemed to fill the small space. "To the chef," he said, nodding to his proud son. "And to the master fisherman," he added, smiling at his beautiful wife. "And," he finished, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid, "to the luckiest man in the entire world." Later that night, the three of them sat around a small crackling bonfire by the edge of the lake, the sparks rising up to meet a brilliant, diamond dust sky full of stars. They were roasting marshmallows, their faces illuminated by the warm, dancing glow of the fire. Silas looked at his son, now a confident, passionate, and good young man, on the verge of his own brilliant future. He looked at his wife, the strong, compassionate, and wise center of his entire world. He thought of the violent, lonely, and empty power he had once wielded. He realized that this, the simple, quiet strength of a family, sharing stories around a fire, their faces full of warmth and love, was the only kind of power, the only kind of wealth that had ever truly mattered. His old life was a distant, faded photograph. This, right here, was real. This was his home. This was his family. And it was everything. 1 year later. The grand opening of the Beacon was the most talked-about event of the Boston culinary scene. The restaurant, a beautifully restored space in a historic North End building, was a perfect reflection of its head chef, elegant but unpretentious, sophisticated but full of a warm, soulful energy. The room buzzed with the excited chatter of food critics, local celebrities, and the city's most influential people, all of them clamoring for a taste of the food from the city's newest star. At the center of it all, but not in the spotlight, was the Thorne family. Alice, radiant in a simple, elegant dress, moved through the crowd, her smile warm and genuine. She was the perfect hostess, the proud wife. Silas, for his part, was not holding court with the city's powerful elite. He was in a quiet corner, laughing with a small group of Alice's old friends from the diner, who were all guests of honor. He was not a don. He was just a husband, a father, glowing with a quiet, profound pride. The true star of the evening was in the kitchen. Ethan, no longer the haunted boy, but a confident and passionate young man, commanded his kitchen with the skill and the artistry of a seasoned professional. He had earned this. He had worked tirelessly, graduating at the top of his class, and this restaurant was not a gift from his father, but an investment his father had made in his proven talent. Later in the evening, Ethan came out of the kitchen, a smudge of flour on his cheek and a brilliant, happy smile on his face. The room erupted in applause. He raised a hand, quieting the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice clear and strong. "There are a lot of people to thank for this incredible night." He thanked his team, his mentors. He thanked his father for his unwavering belief in him. And then his eyes found his mother, Alice, across the room. "But most of all," he said, his voice now thick with an emotion that captivated the entire restaurant, "I need to thank the waitress who, on the worst night of my life, in a dark alley, made the crazy, brave choice to call a dangerous number instead of just walking away. She saved my life in that alley." And, he finished, his love and gratitude a tangible thing in the room, "She has been saving it every single day since. Mum, this is all because of you." Long after the last of the happy guests had departed, the three of them were alone in the quiet, empty dining room of the new restaurant. They were tired, they were happy, and they were sharing a final glass of champagne and a sparkling cider for Ethan to celebrate. "It's funny," Ethan said, looking around at his own beautiful, successful restaurant. "To get all of this, I first had to lose everything and end up unconscious on the pavement in a back alley." Alice reached across the table and took his hand, her smile full of a deep, knowing warmth. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you have to hit the bottom just to find out which way is up." Silas listened, and he looked at his family. He looked at his son, no longer a lost heir, but a good, strong, and independent man who had found his own purpose. He looked at his wife, the quiet, compassionate waitress who had, with a single brave phone call, resurrected his entire world. He thought back to that night, to the cold, hard man he had been, a man who had believed he was the one with all the power, the one doing the rescuing. He realized now that he had had it all backward. That night, in that dark alley, he and his son had been the ones who were truly lost, and it was the poor, simple waitress who had, in the end, saved them both. He raised his glass. "To the beacon," he said. A final, quiet toast, not to the restaurant, but to the woman who had been and would always be his light in the darkness.